Continued from the previous file, questions and answers of Look Back in Anger, page 10. Allison is described as Python, a reptilian snake, swallowing him alive when he makes love to her. Here is a psychological fear about sexual relationship, and at the same time there is a fear of his sense of betrayal. His comments on his mother's attitude to his father in Act 2, Scene 1 illustrates this fear of betrayal. Jimmy's tirade against women culminates in his image of the girl who once had a flat above him and who drove him mad with slamming and stamping. Quote, "the eternal bloody racket of the female," unquote. However, there is the indication of tenderness in Jimmy, which is buried beneath the cruelty and malice of the earlier action. As a matter of fact, Jimmy creates his own fantasy world. The world of squirrels and bears has been the only refuge to which Jimmy and Allison retreat. The childish, insistent demands of Jimmy, the need to feel for command, the strong dependence on characters from the past, all point to the essential tenderness of the man and his retreat to the make-believe world of bears and squirrels. He shows tender feelings to Allison when she is hurt. He loves his father and hues his mother. The arrival of Helena is necessary to pick up the continuing struggle. His attack on women is a means of revealing his own refusal to allow Allison or anyone to discover his need for death. Here the references to Jimmy's mother in Act 2, Scene 1 are obviously important. The father has been betrayed by mother, and he fears that same process of betrayal must occur as an inevitable part of all relationships. In this sense, as well as in a social and political sense, he looks back in anger to the past, and it is this which effectually bars him from any possibility of a future. Thus, the problem of Jimmy is the problem of alienation in the modern existential sense of the term. In this respect, there is a similarity of Jimmy with Hamlet. Jimmy is a modern D-class man. His education has forced him out of one world and yet simultaneously bars him from accepting the alternative world of Allison's mother and brother. Hamlet cannot adjust himself to his milieu of feudal corruptions, decay and narrowness. He is also embittered by the betrayal of his father by mother through her over hasty marriage after death of his father. There is the cynicism, bitter and anger as we find in Jimmy. But Jimmy is an angry young man and his only refuge is a return to the womb of fantasy. Hamlet has a future because his sense of loneliness comes from idealism. But Jimmy has no future because he has no idealism. Jimmy and Allison are united in utter despair. Page 11. Question 3. Discuss the dramatic technique of the play. Is it a self-made play? Answer. John Russell, in his study on the new wave of dramatists entitled Anger and After, pointed out that Osborne's revolutionary play, which shocked and puzzled its first audience in 1956, is essentially, quote, well-made play, unquote. Following the basic three-act structure conceived by the French dramatist Eugene in the mid-19th century. In its simplest form, the well-made play formula seeks to provide a logical ordering of events designed to maintain dramatic suspense and to keep an audience sufficiently informed to be interested in the plot of the drama. For this purpose, it divides the play into three main units: exposition, complication, and denouement. Clearly, Look Back in Anger cannot be fitted into this formula. but many of its elements are present. Act 1, which is long and undivided, serves to introduce all the major characters either on the stage or by description. We meet Jimmy, Allison and Cliff and are shown the uneasy but functioning relationship they have established. In the last part of the Act 1, Scene 1, we are introduced to Helena and are shown the disruptive effect her entrance is likely to produce. We are given lengthy descriptions of all the other characters whose relationship with the main figures in the play shape their present responses. Primarily, these are Allison's father and mother, Hugh's mother, who has set Jimmy up with his sweet stall, Hugh himself, Webster, the only one of Allison's friends whom Jimmy can tolerate. We learn about Allison's pregnancy, the factor that will come up again in a more complex way in Act 2, and which provides a sort of resolution when she loses her child in Act 3. We are introduced to the game of bears and squirrels, and the full explanation of the significance is held over until Act 2, Scene 1, when Allison tells Helena how it became, quote, the one way of escaping from everything for both of them, unquote. Finally, the act ends with Jimmy's receiving the news of the death of his mother, providing an effective climax and allowing the complication of Act 2. In many ways, the first act is constructed in a very direct and simple way along the traditional lines of a well-made play. It provides all the information we need, outlines the characters and their situations, and paints a vivid picture of the atmosphere of stifling boredom into which Jimmy's frustration and violence burst like thunder in sultry, heavy weather. Page 12. The act is subdivided into two scenes. The first scene is concerned with the effect on the existing situation of the arrival of Allison's friend Helena. Helena is puzzled and yet intrigued by the situation she finds. At first, she functions as a device to allow Allison to tell the audience in greater depth about the early days with Jimmy. Now, for the first time, we are allowed, quote, to go behind, unquote, and see the events of the past from her point of view. In this sense, the first action of Act 2, Scene 1, is essentially expository. Helena, as an alternative and fresh target, allows Jimmy to renew his attacks, and we learn of his own past and childhood. Helena functions strongly to enhance and develop the exposition, serving as a catalyst to allow the stands of the past to bear on the situation presented in Act 1, Act 2, Scene 1. Scene 1 also begins the process of complicating the action by introducing the potential for future dramatic ironies. As for example, Jimmy hopes that Allison, who has learned to suffer and understand the meaning of pains, sets up the potential for the response to the loss of their child in Act 3. Act 2, Scene 2 introduces the new figure of Allison's father, an ex-Indian Army colonel. This character serves to complicate the action further by failing to behave in the stereotyped way. His sympathy for his daughter's plight is modified by the sense of how she may have been partly to blame for the separation between herself and Jimmy. A sense of continuity, if not similarity, between the colonel and Jimmy complicates any simple decision which we might make in favor of one and other of the characters. When Helena tells Jimmy at the end of the act that Allison is to have a baby, and he reacts in the violent and bitter outburst, she reveals at the climax of the Act 2 the attraction she has felt for him, which has emerged only obliquely up till this point. The act ends with their passionate embrace. The complications established in Act 1, Scene 2 is now fully rounded off, and Act 3 must resolve it. The time passage between Act 2, Scene 2 and Act 3, Scene 1 is the longest in the play. At first, nothing appears to have changed except that Helena is substituted for Alison as the main target of Jimmy's abuse. Her reactions are less profound and his abuse is less intense. It is a recapitulation of the main theme of the first act, but in a muted tone. There is no real struggle between Jimmy and Helena, and his purpose as a buffer has been done. Jimmy and Alison are left alone to renew their struggle. But there has been a change. Alison, through the loss of the baby, has arrived at the point of desolation which Jimmy wished for her. At the end, Jimmy and she can retreat again to the temporary refuge of bears and squirrels. Page 13. Thus, the play has a formal structure. Osmond himself says that Look Back in Anger is a formal and old-fashioned play, but it is a series of obsessional dramatic monologues of Jimmy Potter. It is questionable how other characters are realized through the stage action. Alison is certainly developed as a character, and the need that she and Jimmy have for one another is clearly shown to affect Jimmy as much as her by the time we arrive at Act 3. Alison makes several significant choices which shape the action of the play. When she chooses to leave, and secondly when she returns. This scene with the father draws attention to the fact that Jimmy and she are in a relationship which has been created by two of them. By the end of the play, she and Jimmy are shown to be locked in a very complex personal relationship. Clift acts as a buffer between Jimmy and Alison, but he has his own deep personal need to establish a relationship. He is a warm and affectionate person, but the indications of a deep insecurity are clearly delineated. His living in Act 3, Scene 1 is a kind of retreat. Helena and Redfern are less complex characters, yet even they are integrated into the main choice which Jimmy's monologues pose, the choice of how to survive in a world where values are in a turmoil. Colonel Redfern serves to emphasize that much of what Jimmy asserts has happened to the present, that it has lost its direction. His regret for those lost values subtly draw attention to the element of nostalgia in Jimmy's cry that there are, quote, no good brave causes left, unquote. Thus, though the play centered only on the series of monologues of Jimmy and the questions that they pose, there is a dramatic action with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The other characters serve to create a rich pattern of reactions which deepen the effect on the audience. Question 4. Indicate the main symbols in Look Back in Anger. Answer. Look Back in Anger has a naturalistic structure. It is considered to be a well-made play with a formal structure, although the chief center of the play is Jimmy's obsessional utterances. In a play like Look Back in Anger, the theme that the audience are asked to note is that what occurs on the stage is a credible imitation of real and natural behavior. It lays emphasis on stage setting to create atmosphere, and all the objects on the stage serve as tools for the actors to convey inner emotions which cannot be convincingly rendered in speeches. Thus, for example, the letter which Alison leaves for Jimmy in Act 2, Scene 2 allows her to make visible, page 14, the difficulty she has in leaving Jimmy and his inability to cope with the attack which she knows her active words would produce. In a naturalistic play, it is difficult for the dramatist to make large discursive comments about events which do not immediately affect the action on the stage. The need to maintain a relatively natural level of language restricts the metaphorical density of the language. Thus, in a natural play, objects are invested with a symbolic importance. There is a difficulty involved in showing inner emotion within the naturalistic structure. However, the setting itself is symbolic in such a play. The choice of place, a flat in a large Midland town, and the time of the year and day, the weather, even the repetitive and domestic task of ironing in which Ellison is engaged when the play opens, all serve to symbolize the dull, flat and purposeless nature of the way of living within which the three characters are trapped. The mood of the play is set in the very opening of the drama. The slow opening, the rustling of the papers, the long, boring emptiness of a chilly spring Midland town where there is nothing to do. The use of overt symbols is clearly a part of the play's effect. The church bells are used time and again to symbolize the hypocritical acceptance of the values of outdated institutions and moral systems. The jazz trumpet of Jimmy is opposed to this as a symbol of a possible freer and more human alternative. Significantly, Ellison tells Helena that before he began to run the sweet stalls, he had his own jazz band and wishes to do so again. The fantasy world of Jimmy is enacted through the game of bears and squirrels in Act 3. It is a symbol of the essentially escapist nature of the relationship that has grown up again between Jimmy and Ellison. The make-believe game of bears and squirrels is more than a retreat from an intolerable situation in their marriage. The image of Jimmy in Act 1 is that of a defeated, brawling animal. His aggressive screaming conduct reminds one of an animal. Again, the language which Ellison uses when she talks of Jimmy illustrates very clearly the confused response to the situation in which she finds herself. The imaginary of barbarian hordes raiding the polite parties, quote, blundering them, wolfing their feet, and then smoking their cigars like ruffians, unquote, modulates into a vision of Jimmy as a knight in armor with an, quote, axe swinging round his head that frail and so full of fire, unquote. It was the old story of the knight in shining armor, except that his armor did not really shine very much. Ellison is aware that her fascination is potentially self-destructive from the start. Page 15. She is aware of the impossibility of reconciling her real perception of Jimmy with the dream image she built. Jimmy attacks woman in animal imagery. He attacks Ellison as a python, a reptilian snake swallowing him alive when he makes love to her. He sees the struggle between man and woman as the struggle between creative sensitivity and the blind instinctive forces. Here, Jimmy's attitude is almost like that of Tanner in Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. The finer speeches of Jimmy introduce the symbol of bear into the main body of the action when he comments on the loneliness of the bear wandering in the dark forest with no warm heart or pack to support him. It may be remarked that both bear and squirrels hibernate to survive the winter, a symbolic hint that Ellison and Jimmy can survive only by a form of retreat from the harshness of reality. Indeed, Ellison feels the fantasy that Jimmy is searching for a womb-like retreat. Jimmy wants, quote, a kind of cross between a mother and the Greek courtesan, a henchwoman, a mixture of Cleopatra and Boswell, unquote. Thus, throughout the play, the action is supported and informed by a network of symbolic allusions which draw attention to the dramatic patterns and deepen their social and philosophical implications. However, it should be noted that all such symbolic allusions are integrated into the naturalistic surface of the action. In this way, they deepen but do not disrupt the realistic structure of the plot. Question 5. Discuss the last scene of Look Back in Anger. Is it convincing? Answer. The final scene of Look Back in Anger, in bracket Act 3 Scene 2, bracket closed, is a logical sequence of the preceding scenes. The third act opens in a situation almost exactly parallel with the opening of Act 1, except, of course, that Helena now occupies the role that Ellison played in the opening. Throughout the conversation between the two women, Jimmy's trumpet can be heard playing jazz very loudly in the room off stage. The difference between Ellison and Helena is brought home in the conversation which follows. Helena asserts the continuity to her of a traditional moral belief which her sexual passion for Jimmy has not altered. Ellison, we learn, has lost the child she was to bear in the conversation between the two women. We see the charity with which each in her own way sees Jimmy. Helena is, however, relieved by, page 16, the return of Ellison. She declares her intention of leaving and her inability to sustain a relationship which demands that she gives up her traditional concepts and exposes herself to the flux of the moral experience. Ellison is also shown as seeing how any single relationship will be insufficient to sustain the kind of openness with which Jimmy demands. She says, quote, he wants something quite different from us. What it is exactly, I don't know. Dash, a kind of cross between the mother and Greek courtesan, a benchwoman, a mixture of Cleopatra and Boswell, unquote. Maddened by the trumpet, Helena calls Jimmy, who enters reluctantly. Helena tells him that she intends to leave. Jimmy's reaction throughout the scene is low-key. He has clearly felt the loss of child. Quote, it was my first child, you know, unquote. Ellison's reply, quote, it was mine, unquote, moves him. Thus, when Helena announces her inability to suffer further, Jimmy's response is pitched from the earlier tone, almost dissociated from her. Quote, they all want to escape from the fate of being alive, and most of all from love, unquote. The church bells, which throughout the play have been symbolically countered by the non-silenced jazz trumpet, start ringing again. Helena leaves, and Jimmy and Ellison are left alone. It is to the image of the bear that he returns, but now it is significantly related to the experience of the play as a whole. Quote, like the old bear following his own breath in the dark forest, there is no warm pack, no hut to comfort him, unquote. The despair he feels now is in the open, and his final appeal to Ellison is a straightforward and direct one. Quote, I may be a lost cause, but I thought if you love me, it did not matter, unquote. Her response is the most frank and total commitment she has achieved in the play. Whether for good or bad, as a result of her experience, she is no longer sitting on the fence. Wholeheartedly she joins him in his despair. Quote, I don't want to be a saint. I want to be a lost cause. I want to be corrupt and futile. Unquote. In the long speech that follows, she reveals her soul for the first time. She has been through the flames of suffering due to the loss of the child. For better or for worse, she and Jimmy have arrived at the bottom of the pit. Quote, don't you see? I am in the mud at last. I am groveling. I am crawling. Oh God. Unquote. Jimmy is desperate and disturbed at the very moment when he sees the essence of modern life and is overwhelmed by a feeling of the personal hell in which he has put himself. They have joined each other in the hell of consciousness. The only place for them is to retreat to the safety of the fantasy world of bears and squirrels. Continued in the next file.